Chicago was a city that never seemed to sleep, its skyline glittering with ambition, its streets filled with hurried footsteps. Among the towering buildings stood Richard Hayes, a name everyone in real estate knew. He was the CEO of Hayes Development, a company that owned half the skyscrapers in downtown. To the world, Richard was a man of power, wealth, and influence. He drove sleek cars, dined in high-end restaurants, and signed contracts worth millions without hesitation. Yet, behind his sharp gaze and perfectly tailored suits, there lived a man who carried an emptiness no one could see. At 52, Richard had no family waiting for him at home, no children to bring laughter into his mansion, and no wife to share his triumphs or failures. His life was a schedule of meetings, expensive dinners, and silent nights, where his only company was the sound of the city outside his penthouse windows. That night was like any other. Richard entered his favorite steakhouse in downtown Chicago, greeted warmly by the staff who knew his routine. He always sat at the same corner table, ordered the same meal, medium rare ribeye with garlic mashed potatoes, and sipped a glass of red wine as he scrolled through emails on his phone. To the waiters and patrons, he seemed like a man completely at ease, but in truth, his meals were silent rituals of loneliness. The laughter of families dining together caught his ears more than he admitted, especially the sound of children, which stirred a quiet ache in his chest. His dinner was nearly over, the glass of wine half finished, when the unusual happened. Two small shadows stopped at the side of his table. He looked up, expecting maybe a server or the manager. Instead, he found two identical little girls standing before him. They couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. Their hair was a little tangled from the cold Chicago wind, and their coats looked several winters too old. Yet their eyes, large, round, and brown, were alive with both shyness and hope. Richard blinked, unsure if they had wandered in by mistake, but then one of them spoke softly. "Sir, may we have your leftovers?" The words hit him like a blow. In all his years of wealth, no one had ever asked him something so simple, so heartbreaking. For a moment, Richard didn't move. His fork rested midway in the air, his mind scrambling to understand the situation. He had given to charities, sponsored shelters, and cut checks for social programs without thinking twice. But this was different. This wasn't a number on a donation slip. This was real, raw hunger staring at him with wide, pleading eyes. Richard glanced at the half-eaten steak on his plate, then back at the twins. 1,000 questions rushed through his head. Where were their parents? Why were they here alone? And why did their little voices tremble as though they weren't sure if he would scold them for asking? He wanted to respond, but no words came out at first. In the boardroom, Richard always had answers. In negotiations, his tongue was sharper than any lawyer, siglo. But now, confronted by two children in need, his throat tightened. The restaurant had gone strangely quiet, as if the world itself was waiting to see what he would do. The twins stood patiently, their small hands clasped together, as though holding each other gave them courage. For the first time in years, Richard felt his heart soften, an unfamiliar word mth pushing through the walls of solitude he had carefully built. The memory of his past flickered unexpectedly. Richard had once been married, decades ago. His wife, Claire, had dreamed of children, but fate had been cruel. After years of trying, they lost hope, and soon after, they lost each other too. Richard had buried that chapter under years of work, telling himself that success was enough to replace the family he never had. But now, as those little girls looked at him with eyes full of hunger, he felt the wound open again. They weren't his children, but in that moment, they could have been. He saw in their faces what his life had missed: innocence, trust, and the fragile need for care. The ache he had buried came rushing back, and it nearly broke him. He realized then that his wealth couldn't shield him from this truth. Loneliness was heavier than any fortune he had ever built. The girls waited silently. Richard noticed the smallest details about them now: the scuffed shoes, the thin gloves, the way they stood close together as though the world outside had taught them to cling for safety. Something inside him shifted. Slowly, he put down his fork and knife, his hand shaking slightly. Without a word, he slid the plate of steak and potatoes toward them. Their eyes widened, disbelief flashing across their faces. For a brief second, Richard thought they might run away, scared of being scolded. But then one of them whispered, "Thank you, sir," her voice barely above a breath. It wasn't just gratitude, it was relief. Richard's chest tightened as he watched them share the food carefully, as though they had learned how to stretch every bite. His life had been full of luxury, but he had never seen a meal savored with such reverence and joy. The restaurant's atmosphere returned to normal, but Richard's world had changed. He couldn't take his eyes off the little girls as they ate his dinner. Every bite they took was a reminder of how different his life was from theirs, and how empty his wealth felt in comparison. A strange thought crept into his mind: when was the last time he had shared a meal with anyone, let alone children? Years, maybe decades. He realized how many birthdays, holidays, and family dinners he had missed, not because he didn't have the means, but because he had no one to share them with. The clinking of their small forks against the plate was like music, filling the silence that had haunted him for so long. For the first time in years, Richard felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever: connection. And it scared him. Richard sat frozen, his wine untouched, as the two little girls ate quietly at his table. He couldn't shake the feeling that life had brought them to him for a reason. For years, he had lived in a tower of glass and steel, shielded by money, but here, in the simple act of watching children eat, he felt more human than he had in decades. A waiter approached, hesitant, perhaps ready to escort the girls out, but Richard raised his hand gently. "Here with me," he said, his voice softer than anyone in the restaurant had ever heard. The waiter nodded, surprised, and left them alone. Richard leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He wanted to know everything: who they were, why they were alone, and where their parents were. The urge to protect them burned inside him, stronger than any business deal he had ever pursued. When the plate was nearly empty, Richard spoke at last. "Where's your mom or dad?" The twins exchanged a glance, their eyes dimming. One of them looked down, fidgeting with her fork. The other whispered, "Mama sick. She couldn't come out." The words struck Richard like a hammer. He could hear the unspoken truth: if they were here, begging for scraps, their mother must have been struggling far more than they admitted. His chest tightened. He remembered his own mother, who had raised him alone after his father walked out. She had sacrificed everything to make sure he never went hungry. The twins' words brought back memories he hadn't touched in years. "Where do you live?" he asked gently. "On Dose Street, in the shelter," one answered. Richard swallowed hard. Just blocks away from his $1 million condo, children were living in shelters. He felt shame ripple through him like a cold wave. Richard signaled the waiter again, but this time, he didn't just order more food. "2 meals to go," he said fiercely, "and hot chocolate." The girls' faces lit up as though he had given them the world. As they waited, Richard leaned forward. "What are your names?" "Emily," said one softly. "And Emma," added the other, almost in unison. Their twin voices carried both innocence and resilience. Richard smiled faintly, repeating their names under his breath as if to etch them into his heart. The two go bags arrived, warm with freshly cooked food, and Richard handed them over carefully. But he didn't want the night to end there. A battle raged in his mind: was it his place to get involved? Or would turning away make him the same cold man he had been yesterday? Deep down, he knew the answer. For once in his life, he wanted to care. "Let me drive you home," he said at last. The twins hesitated, their little eyes narrowing with caution. They had clearly been taught not to trust strangers, even kind ones. Richard quickly added, "You'll sit in the back, and I'll take you straight to your mom. No tricks." Something in his voice must have convinced them, because after a moment, Emily nodded. Outside, his sleek black sedan gleamed under the streetlights. Richard opened the door for them, feeling oddly nervous, as though he were doing something that mattered more than any deal he'd ever signed. The girls climbed in, clutching the food bags tightly. The drive to the shelter was quiet, broken only by the sound of their small breed HS. Richard kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, struck by how fragile they looked against the backdrop of luxury leather seats. For the first time, his car felt useful. They arrived at a rundown shelter on Dose Street, its bricks chipped and windows covered with plastic to keep out the cold. Richard parked and walked them inside. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the dim lights flickered overhead. On an old cot in the corner lay a woman, cooking weakly, her face pale but kind. She struggled to sit up when she saw her daughters approach with food. "Mama!" the girls cried, rushing to her side. Richard stood back, watching quietly as the woman hugged them, her frail arms trembling. He had seen multi-million-dollar skyscrapers rise from the ground, yet nothing compared to the strength of this sick mother fighting to keep her children fed. She looked up at him with grateful, teary eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard nodded, unable to find words. He realized then that true poverty wasn't just hunger, it was being invisible to the world. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by expensive art and silent halls, he kept seeing Emily and Emma's eyes. He replayed the moment they had asked for his leftovers, and the way their mother had whispered thanks. For years, he had measured his worth in dollars, but now he saw the emptiness in his reflection. The next morning, he made a decision. Instead of heading to his office, he drove straight to the shelter. The director, an older man with weary eyes, greeted him courteously. When Richard introduced himself, the man nearly laughed. Why would a billionaire step into a place most ignored? But Richard was serious. He offered funding for repairs, meals, medical care, and tutors for the children. "No press," he insisted. "This isn't for show." For the first time in decades, Richard wasn't investing in buildings. He was investing in people. Weeks turned into months. Richard's visits became regular, and they grew especially close to Emily and Emma. He helped with homework, brought them books, and sometimes simply sat on the floor with them, listening to their laughter. Their mother's health improved with proper treatment, funded quietly by Richard. Slowly, the cold, guarded CEO softened. The staff at his company noticed the change too, smiled more, spoke with patience, and even allowed himself afternoons off, something unthinkable before. The world saw him as a tycoon, but Emily and Emma saw him as something far greater, a friend. One evening, as he walked them back to the shelter, Emily slipped her small hand into his. "You're not lonely anymore, are you?" she asked. Richard felt his throat tighten. For years, loneliness had been his only companion. But now, holding that little hand, he realized she was right. He wasn't alone anymore. Richard's life was never the same again. He continued to run his empire, but his priorities shifted. Every deal, every project, he now saw through a different lens. How could it help families, children, and those who were invisible in the city he once ignored? His wealth no longer existed only in bank accounts and buildings. It lived in meals served, medical bills paid, and laughter restored. On his birthday, for the first time in decades, Richard didn't celebrate alone. Emily, Emma, their mother, and several children from the shelter gathered in a small room decorated with balloons and paper streamers. The twins sang for him, their voices sweet and pure, and Richard's eyes filled with tears. He realized then that his story had come a full circle. A lonely man had been saved not by power or money, but by the simple plea of two hungry little girls.